I'm Green Hut. And if your teeth are stained from coffee, tea, or smoking, Power Swabs is the answer. In 5 minutes, you'll see 2 shades whiter teeth, and in 7 days, 6 shades. Even better, there's no messy strips or trays that you'll have to leave in your mouth for an hour. Just swab your teeth for 5 minutes, and you're done. To try Power Swabs, call 1-800-679-0969. Your bright white smile will have your friends talking about how great you look. Try it risk-free. 1-800-679-0969. That's 1-800-679-0969.
Have you heard? Proactive Plus is faster and better than ever. Stay tuned for a $1 million bottle giveaway, and you'll also receive free shipping. With Proactive Plus, your acne can heal, and you can help prevent new breakouts. Don't miss this limited time offer. We're going to let 1 million people try Proactive Plus risk-free and get 2 free gifts, and also receive free shipping when you call right now. Call 800-393-6272. That's 800-393-6272.
Well, good afternoon. This is George Yates, and this is Justice for All. And welcome to our show today. We're going to have a great show here for the next hour. And it's another lovely day out there. Beautiful Saturday afternoon. We're broadcasting live here from K-Talk Radio, 1650 AM here in Portsmouth, Virginia. And my guest today is Howard Covington, Jr. He's a former journalist for the Charlotte Observer in North Carolina. And he's an historian, a biographer, and he's written a book about a gentleman named Henry Fry, who was North Carolina's first African-American Chief Justice. And he's here on the show with us today. How you doing, Mr. Covington?
Good, thank you.
Thanks for coming on the show today. I heard that we didn't really confirm it, apparently, but here you are, so it's great to have you. I went to law school at Wake Forest graduated in 82. And it's interesting. I was scanning through your book and learning about this gentleman, Mr. Fry, Henry Fry, who, and I saw that he was doing a little bit of political posturing with Rhoda Billings there for a time when she was a law professor of mine at Wake Forest. So I was kind of going, I know some of these people in this book. But apparently, Mr. Fry or Henry Fry, Chief Justice Fry, was what year was he the Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court?
He was from 1999 till 2001.
So it was just the 2 years.
Well, he was on the court for 20 years.
Right, I saw that.
He went on the court in 1983 and was Associate Justice, and then was appointed Chief Justice in 1999.
Well, tell us about Henry Fry. I mean, I think that the way to make this book really come alive, I would think, is to tell his life in the larger context, I suppose, of the rise of African Americans in public life really throughout the whole 20th century. Isn't that really the point of this, is when you start talking about Henry Fry, who's a major civil rights leader in his own way in North Carolina. And I would guess that parallels the careers of many other people, both in Virginia and Georgia and South Carolina throughout the South, right?
Yeah, probably so. Henry or Justice Fry was born in the early 1930s. He was a college student, became a college student in 1949, graduated from North Carolina A&T University in Greensboro in 1953, just 1 year before the Brown decision. He went into the military, was in ROTC during his college years, and came out and was commissioned a lieutenant and served 2 years in the United States Air Force. Came back to North Carolina, and he actually had a more of a scientific background as a college student, and thought about becoming a dentist, but that didn't really sound like a very good career. So he enrolled as in the law school in 1956. It was the University of North Carolina law school had been required by court order in the early 50s to admit African Americans, and there had been African American students in the law school, but most of them had been transfers. Justice Frye was the first to enroll as a first year and then graduate in 1959, having finished all of his 3 years there in Chapel Hill. He started a law practice here in Greensboro, where there were a handful of African American lawyers. Was involved in the civil rights movement in the 60s, probably in a way that the majority or the greatest number of African Americans were, which was as an interested and as a supporter. He was not the kind of person who got out and marched in the streets, although he and his wife Shirley, who was also a college graduate and had a master's degree in special education, participated in one march here in Greensboro. But where I think he felt he could make the greatest use of his talents was as a lawyer. Got interested in politics, was elected to the General Assembly in 1968, served his first session in 1969, and was in the legislature as a House member and as a state senator until the early 80s, when he decided not to run for re-election. But he was the first African American who was elected to the North Carolina legislature, and that was, during the 70s was a time when more and more African Americans were being elected to public office. Julian Bond in the legislature in Georgia, and Gene Wilder was elected lieutenant governor and then finally governor in Virginia, right?
Yep.
Not Gene Wilder.
Douglas Wilder.
Douglas Wilder. Gene Wilder was the actor. Douglas
comedian.
Wilder, who actually came to Greensboro and spoke at a fundraising event for Henry when he was in the legislature. But Governor Jim Hunt appointed Frye to the Supreme Court, and of course, up to that point, there had been no African American there were some African Americans in the judicial system, a few district court judges, I think some specially appointed superior court judges. North Carolina had one federal judge who was appointed during the Carter era, someone who had served in the legislature with Frye, but Frye went on the court in in 1983 as an associate justice. You were talking about Rhoda Billings. She was the first Republican appointed to the court, which created quite a stir because the governor not only appointed her to the court, but he made her chief justice and didn't follow the tradition of appointing the senior justice as the chief justice. And the governor, who was a Republican, said, well, that was their tradition, meaning the Democrats. That wasn't his tradition. So he put Rhoda Billings on as the chief justice, and she was there for about 6 months, and she lost re-election.
Well, that's in North Carolina, you get appointed to the Supreme Court, but then you have to run for re-election. What's that all about? I mean, once we have the actual Supreme Court justices run for re-election in North Carolina.
Yes, they run for election. Justice Frye was appointed to an unfinished term, so he had to run in the next election for the balance of that term, and then ran for a full term 2 years later.
And he was elected?
And he was elected, yeah. And reelected. Let's see, it would be three. He went through 3 elections. Was elected to the court 3 times.
How is he able to do that when you've got you've got a it's not a ward system, is it? I mean, it's he's a black justice, and would he be running against? I guess but he ran as a Democrat. I would take it, right? He's a Democrat.
Well, he was a Democrat,
and Republicans had a heck of a time in those days getting elected in North Carolina. So
there were the Republicans had elected a governor in the 1980s. They had elected a governor in '72 who served one term, and then Governor Martin was elected in 1982. In 1984, and served two terms. But the Republicans were not fielding candidates for the statewide judicial races, or candidates of any particular quality that the party would really get behind. That changed in the 90s when Republicans started paying more attention to the judicial races and putting up fairly strong candidates in these statewide elections.
So I see this fellow Henry Fry was also a United States attorney or assistant U.S. attorney in the early 60s.
He was, and that was an interesting turn. There was a fellow, a banker in Durham, who was very important in the National Black Banking Association, and with some good connections to the Kennedys back in the 1960 election. And one of the things he wanted was to see an African American in the U.S. Attorney's office down here. So Robert Kennedy appointed, I think there were three, at the time, there were three African Americans who were appointed as assistant U.S. attorneys. One was in Virginia, one was here, and one was in Texas. And Henry was the one appointed in North Carolina, and he was in the U.S. Attorney's office for about 2.5 years.
Is that the Middle District of North Carolina?
The Middle District, which created some interesting situations because white folks didn't see many African American faces in the federal judicial system, and it also the staff in the U.S. Attorney's office wasn't used to having somewhat of another color in their midst, and but it was that was a time of great change during the 1960s, and Henry handled it with fairly good aplomb, and by the time he left, his boss, who was was not happy to see him arrive. His boss was really sorry to see him go. He told him he had done a good job.
Well, of course, the United States attorneys were appointed by the president. So, in that particular case, we had probably Kennedy appointing the U.S. attorney in the first place, right? So he would have been a Democrat. It makes you wonder why he would be upset. To have at first anyway. What was your take on that? How did you know that was an unpleasant arrival for him?
How do I know that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it was talking with the U.S. attorney who was, or the fellow who was the U.S. attorney, had died. But I did talk to one of another assistant who was in the office at the time.
I see.
Mm-hmm. Henry arrived, and he told me a little bit of background on that. Kennedy had followed which was the tradition at the time. Had followed the advice or followed the request of the U.S. senators from North Carolina in making the appointments of the U.S. attorneys and the U.S. marshals, which were patronage jobs that were usually came through the congressional offices. But and so he did as Sam Ervin and Everett Jordan wanted him to, and the naming of the U.S. Attorney. But he also had his own plans for some of the assistant jobs, which were not ones that normally the U.S. Attorney, the Attorney General, paid that much attention to. He'd pretty much leave it up to the local USA to make the other appointments.
Yeah, my cousin was the U.S. Attorney there. His name is Walter Holton. He was the U.S. Attorney there in 91 to 99, I guess. He was a Clinton appointee. And I guess one of the few, he was a classmate of mine from Wake Forest Law School, too. So, but anyway, that middle district there, that's based in Greensboro then. So are you in Greensboro right now as we speak?
Yes.
And your background as a journalist from Charlotte. What interested you in writing this book about Henry Fry? I mean, it's a very well-researched book, and you chose him as your subject, I guess, and according that you've written many books. What was it about Henry Fry that interested you enough to write this book? And if you've just joined us, this is George Yates. This is Justice for All, and I'm here with Howard Covington, Jr. He's a biographer and historian and a former journalist. Howard, why did you pick Henry Fry?
Well, I've been writing history and biography, North Carolina subjects primarily, for about 20 years. And it was pretty evident that the coverage of African American life in North Carolina, and for that matter in the South, really sort of ended with the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. There hadn't been much written about African Americans in the post-Brown era, after the Brown v. Board. What happened to an occasional biography here and there, perhaps, but so what I wanted to do was find a subject that who I thought I could tell the story of the transition from segregation to whatever it is we have today through the life of somebody here in North Carolina. I had known Justice Fry for a number of years. I was a reporter at the Charlotte Observer in 1969 when he was elected to the legislature, and had covered him then, and in subsequent sessions of the General Assembly and in politics. And then I moved to Greensboro in the early 80s to work for the Greensboro paper before going out on my own and started writing books. And I'd known him here, and had also gotten to know his wife Shirley, who was just as impressive an individual as her husband is in her own right, and her involvement in civic and political affairs in North Carolina and nationally. So I tugged on his sleeve, Justice Fry's sleeve, for a long time. I said, I really want to do this book. And he said, well, I'm going to write it myself. And finally, I went to Shirley and I said, I want to do this, but if Henry's going to do it on his own, I'm not going to get in his way. And she said, well, let me talk to him. And he finally agreed to let me do it. I think he finally he realized that he wasn't going to get around to it if it was just something he was going to do himself. So I used them as not to tell their story, only their story, but also as a way to write about what was happening with the lives of the African Americans who became leaders in the latter half of the 20th century. Where did they come from? How were their lives shaped? What was the things that motivated them, and what difference did they make? And they proved to be very good subjects for that sort of thing. As I said, they were obviously involved in the movement in the 60s. During the 70s, that shifted to political influence, and and participation, which was when African American voters began to have an impact in North Carolina politics and were elected to public office. And then in the 80s and 90s, of course, his years on the court were years of change too, as North Carolina sort of shifted from very much a one-party state to a competitive two-party state.
Well, so Henry Fry goes in the United States Attorney's Office, spends a couple of years there, and leaves to go back out into private practice again. He wants to go start making some money. He actually becomes a professor, I guess, at North Carolina Central, which, later on becomes North Carolina Central Law School, right? Mm-hmm. And starts trying to practice law and make some money. How successful was he in law practice, and how did he get from there to starting to get into politics? Tell us how that career trajectory began.
Well, he was really developed. I mean, he had mixed feelings when John Wheeler told him that you're going to get a call from the U.S., from the Attorney General asking you to go to the U.S. Attorney's Office. And Wheeler was the sort of the big daddy in African American affairs, particularly political affairs in North Carolina. And Henry wasn't exactly in a position to say no, even though his law practice was just beginning to take off. But he said, okay, I'll do it. And when he finished, when he decided to leave the U.S. Attorney's Office, he was starting from scratch again. And the teaching job at North Carolina Central was a good starting point, I guess. I mean, it gave him a little bit of income as he began building up his law practice.
Yeah, but being a black dude that's got experience in the as an AUSA, that's got to be pretty lucrative in North Carolina, right? I mean, that's a pretty nice claim to fame that you're former federal prosecutor, and I would think that people would beat feet to your door for that kind of representation.
Yeah, and I think that did help. It helped him attract a couple of younger associates, and by the time he was elected to the General Assembly, he had a pretty good law practice here.
Now, the General Assembly is a part-time job, kind of like it is here in Virginia. I mean, a delegate is not really a...
Yeah, even more so then as than in today. I mean, they had one session that lasted about 6 or 7 months, and then you passed the year, and then you came back in the other odd-numbered year and had another session.
Did he ever consider maybe running for Congress or going for any kind of national politics, or did he stay just a state rep?
After he left the legislature in the early 80s, he played around when there was a seat that was sort of going back and forth here in this district, and he considered it, but really didn't want to. The legislative. I mean, he'd had enough of the legislative life. That was not something that really interested him. He was thinking about running for governor.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a good one. We're going to go to a break here in just a minute, so let's keep this answer short for me. But did he flirted with that, and what did he get shot down by the local power people, or what happened? How come?
No, by the time he had made up his mind that that's what he wanted to do, was about the time that Governor Hunt asked him to take a seat on the state Supreme Court.
They kicked him out. He didn't want to run against him, I guess. Huh?
No, it didn't have anything to do with that, but because Hunt was on his way out. I mean, he was in his last term, but his political ambitions hadn't gotten that far along.
Right.
I mean that. But then he had another decision to make. Do I, is the court the place where I want to be? And
because sometimes you have to take a pay cut to be a judge too. If you got a successful law practice, that's not always that's sometimes a downward move if you're making a lot of money.
Yeah, and I don't. I'm trying to recall here. It was probably a little bit of a cut, but
hey, the Supreme Court of North Carolina, that's a pretty prestigious job.
Right, and also to be the as the first African American to serve on the court
was turn that down.
Was there? He was under some pressure from folks who he'd been not offered the job, but he'd been on a list of appointees for a couple of years. And
we're going to take a short break here, Howard, and we'll come right back here. We're going to talk about Henry Fry, the one of the South's leading black leaders from North Carolina, and we'll be right back. This is George Yates with Justice for All.
The place for authentic Indian food is the India Palace. They feature authentic Indian cuisine, have a party hall, and do catering and banquets. Open daily for lunch and dinner, they showcase an excellent lunch buffet at their Chesapeake and Virginia Beach locations. Visit their 2 locations at 1437 Sam's Drive in Chesapeake off of Battlefield Boulevard and 5600 Virginia Beach Boulevard in Virginia Beach, and online at IndiaPalaceVB.com. On Facebook, look for India Palace Virginia Beach and India Palace Bar and Grill. Dine at the India Palace today.
Leaky faucet, refinishing old countertops? Hey, Gary Sullivan here. Perhaps you're restaining a deck or painting your living room. Whatever it is, let me help. I'm here to give you the tip you need to finish those
President Obama took on Kenya's law banning homosexuality.
That's the path whereby freedoms begin to erode. And when a government gets in the habit of treating people differently, those habits can spread.
But Kenya's President Uhuru Kenyatta brushed off gay rights concerns. He did speak out, though, against Islamic extremists. Years of deadly attacks by al-Shabaab extremists have prompted terror concerns in East Africa.
This is an existential fight for us. This is something that we have not been familiar with. Kenya has always been a country that has respected different religions.
And President Obama also addressed corruption as he works to increase trade with Kenya.
Over time, when people of integrity at the highest levels say this is a priority, we're going to stop this, that begins to change the culture.
CBS News Update, I'm Steve Dorsey.
Leaky faucet, refinishing old countertops? Hey, Gary Sullivan here. Perhaps you're restaining a deck or painting your living room. Whatever it is, let me help. I'm here to give you the tips you need to finish those pesky projects you've been putting off. If you're restaining, have a tip for that. Can't get the paint off the hardwood floors? Got a tip for that too. I'm here to make sure that $5 repair doesn't turn into a $500 repair. Join me right here every weekend.
Saturdays at noon, Sundays at 9 a.m. on AM 1650 WHKT, The Answer.
Okay, we're back. I'm George Yates. This is Justice for All. We're with Howard Covington. We're talking about Henry Fry. And Howard Covington Jr. has written this book called Henry Fry, North Carolina's First African-American Chief Justice. I see there's some photographs in your book of Henry Fry with Julian Bond from Georgia, and you mentioned Douglas Wilder, who was the governor of Virginia. How does Henry Fry's career in the legislature and then moving up to justice of the Supreme Court parallel some of these other black leaders in the South in your view?
Well,
because it seems that they all seem to have their rise. It seems like there's kind of a bit of affirmative action amongst the. Here we've got Fry, who gets appointed as assistant U.S. attorney, and I'm sure he's qualified and all. But here it is, where Robert Kennedy's attorney general and says, we have to appoint a black assistant U.S. attorney. So, Fry, you're it. It's interesting how some of the at a time in our society where it was important that we integrate black professionals into the professions where they'd been excluded for so long, that someone like Fry can rise so quickly because he is qualified, and there he is. When we need you need a black judge, for instance, you need a black U.S. attorney, and so he's the guy. So how was it that he, let's say, was head and shoulders above his competition? How was it that he was able to rise to the top at this point in time?
He's a very smart guy.
Okay, well that helps.
He was. My first thought was I was going to say he was lucky. He was.
Well, that helps too.
He was fortunate to have, as a youngster, a principal in a broken down rural school, a principal who really believed in and pushing his students to achieve. He was a man who was well educated himself. He was a graduate of Shaw University in Raleigh, and was the principal at this all black school in just out in rural Richmond County in North Carolina. But he hired teachers who were well trained, and he motivated them to motivate his students. So by the time they finished his school, they had been given as good an education, if not better an education, than most young African American kids received in the South. Henry moved on to A&T University, which had a good, strong tradition of taking, in some cases, poorly trained students. Henry wasn't one of them, but taking these kids out of these rural North Carolina schools and turning them into first-rate students and setting them on paths to a career. He certainly had his, there were plenty of setbacks along the way. I mean, there were a number of jobs that he didn't get that he applied for because he was black.
Tell this is an interesting thing. You read your book at this kind of time. What sort of barriers were there to black people? I know he'd finished college, he said, in 1953, and then he went to Carolina Law School, Chapel Hill. So let's say he's getting out of law school. It's 1956. I mean, you're still in the area of Jim Crow, aren't you, in North Carolina?
Very much so.
Yeah, what kind of barriers are still there? I mean, there's so much segregation, and still it's prevalent in North Carolina in 1956.
Well, he didn't start it, and he graduated in 1953 and came back in 1956 and went to law school.
I'm sorry, graduated in 1959. That's right.
And then graduated in 1959. Well, the day he got married, he went to the Register of Deeds office in his hometown in Ellerbe, North Carolina, and was refused. The registrar refused to register him to vote because he said he failed the literacy test. Well. And Henry was really kind of dumbfounded. He said, "Yeah, you know me. I graduated from the university, and I was a lieutenant in the United States Air Force. But you say I can't register to vote." And he said, "No, you didn't pass the literacy." He can't remember exactly what it was that he was asked to write this and question that. So, I mean, this was, I guess that was as good an example of the conditions that existed for African Americans as you could find.
How in the world is that possible?
Well, fortunately, his father was a logger and was well known among some of the powers that be in the county, and Henry, he was on his way to Greensboro when he went by the register to vote. He was on his way to Greensboro to get married, and this was on a Saturday, so he couldn't mount an appeal on a Saturday morning on his wedding day. But when he got back from his honeymoon, he called the register, the chairman of the board of elections, who was someone who knew his father, and told him what had happened, and the guy told him to go back, and there would be another clerk there, and he would be sure and be registered to vote. But he did get registered to vote, but at that time there were like 10% of the African Americans in Richmond County who were registered voters.
If that.
So it was, that was just the way things were in North Carolina at that time.
That's the way they were.
Even with Brown, the schools were still segregated for the most part. I mean, there was token integration in a couple of cities, but all public accommodations were still segregated. When he was in the U.S. Attorney's office, and this was in 1963. The Civil Rights Act of '64 hadn't passed, hadn't come along yet, opening up public accommodations. And anyhow, his boss sent him up to Wilkes County, Wilkesboro, up in the mountains, to handle some business for the U.S. Corps of Engineers. And one of Henry's concerns when he left the office was whether he was going to be able to find a hotel to stay in or a restaurant where he could eat. And fortunately, his boss was smart enough to know it would be an embarrassment to the government if one of his employees was turned away from a hotel, so he made sure that he had a place to stay by the time he got up there.
So he's got obviously a bit of a pedigree, and so he can't register to vote because of this ridiculous literacy test that's obviously a sham and a phony thing.
Right.
But what about all the other black folks that tried to register and they got this you failed the literacy test and they didn't have any political levers to pull? They just walked away and didn't vote.
Exactly.
And it wasn't until
he was the only one in his family, in his immediate family, who was registered to vote. Most of them just didn't bother.
Right, because they knew they'd probably be turned down.
Yeah.
Well, and then
it wasn't. I mean, there wasn't anybody paying attention to them. Politicians didn't care about their votes.
And that was the situation at basically when they did the March on Selma 4 or 5 years later.
Yeah.
Because I think maybe only 2% or 10% or whatever that county, Harris County, whatever county that was in Selma, that was the same thing. Back in Reconstruction, right after the Civil War, I think over 90% of black males were registered to vote, and by the turn of the century, it was down to 5%, and it remained that way for over 60, 70 years until those laws were rolled back. It's really an amazing period in American history.
Right. Exactly.
And here he was.
One of the first bill that Henry introduced when he got to the legislature was a constitutional amendment to repeal the literacy test.
And was it successful?
Actually,
I don't
no.
believe it was.
It passed the legislature. He got it out of the legislature, and it got on the ballot, but it failed on the ballot. About that time, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that literacy tests were unconstitutional. So it didn't go back on the ballot again.
I see. So across the South, those literacy tests were banned.
Yes.
Well, tell us some of his accomplishments then as a legislator and as a Supreme Court Associate Justice and Chief Justice. What's he known for, Howard, as far as achievements while he's in those offices?
Well, as a legislator, he was involved with was one of the early and very vigorous opponents of capital punishment, and tried to get capital punishment repealed through 2 or 3 sessions. It was never successful, unfortunately, but that was an issue that he spent a lot of time with.
And what was his argument based on? What was his main point? Why was he against it? Just death penalty in general?
Yeah.
Or did he think it was racist? Or
not that it was. No, at that time there was not so much that it was just that it fell harder on one segment of the society over the other, but that it was just wrong. That of course became an issue. He had to confront that again as a justice on the Supreme Court. His idea was, he had to handle capital cases while he was a justice, and those bothered him a great deal, and he would do whatever he could within the limits of his role as an appellate judge to see that if capital punishment was going to be applied in this case, that it was done that the trial and prosecution of the victim, the convicted, was done in a proper manner.
Sounds like he was in the dissent a lot.
Yes.
I guess.
Just a guess. He was not alone. There was to his early years on the court, the Chief Justice himself, a fellow named Jim Exum, was also an opponent of the death penalty. But they still had to deal with death cases as they came before them.
Okay, so capital punishment, and of course we know he tried to abolish the literacy. What else? What else is he known for?
And on the court, he really became. I mean, some of the cases that had the greatest impact were those which nobody else. Which you really don't show up, I guess, in headlines. One case, which one of the first cases he handled, had to do with minority rights of shareholders, and it's become a fairly important case and used throughout business law and in North Carolina business law at least, and upholding the rights of minority shareholders in small corporations. And as I was yawning through the decision he wrote in this case, I mean that this is not exciting stuff. I said, Henry, this sort of reminds me of. I mean, you could apply the same reasoning that you've applied in this business case, in the rights of individuals, in the civil rights of individuals. And he said, "Well, you're absolutely right. That in a way, his experience in dealing with civil rights sort of informed his opinions about how minorities should be treated in other situations."
Right, because when you've got this democratic form of government, the majority can impose its will on the minority all the time if it wants to, and so that's where the role of the Supreme Court, where a lot of people believe the role of the Supreme Court is to come in and to protect the rights of minorities and people who otherwise are going to be, their rights could be taken away, under the democratic process, because majority rules doesn't necessarily mean that minority doesn't get anything or has their rights taken away. And I think that's so as a minority in the rest of society, he got identified with the minority shareholders. That's a interesting analogy, isn't it?
And I mean, it was the way the court assigns cases here. It was one that he didn't have to take, but it was one and it was in the first round of cases that he sat on. But I mean, it was the plight of the minority shareholders in this case was something that really caught his attention, and none of the other justices wanted to mess with it because it was a very complicated business arrangement.
Well, now he was then a Supreme Court justice for almost 20 years.
He was an associate justice for 16 years, from 83 to 99, and then Chief Justice for about 18 months. And as Chief Justice, of course, he is the he's the head of the third branch of government, the judiciary, and his elevation as Chief Justice was more than just changing seats on the bench. It meant that he was in charge of the state's entire judicial system. Under North Carolina law, the lower courts are administered by the Administrative Office of the Courts, which is presided over by the Chief Justice. So he was assigning judges to cases. He was making sure that the clerk's offices and other functions of the state judiciary were were properly functioning, and in some of the more rural backwater counties, they'd never they'd never had somebody like Henry or his the people that he sent out to check on things show up and start asking questions.
So in 2001, he retired, or was he?
No, he was defeated in his election for Chief Justice. That was in the election of 2000. Another justice on the court, Beverly Lake,
ran against him.
Was prevailed by the Republicans to run against him, and Lake was the son of a fellow by the same. His father was I. Beverly Lake, and ran against Terry Sanford in 1960 in the last blatantly segregationist campaign that the state had ever seen. His son Beverly Jr. did not share his father's politics, but the Lake name still meant a great deal in some areas of the state. So it was sort of an ironic twist of history that
the son of a segregationist ends up defeating the first
Henry
African American
in his race for Chief Justice.
So tell me, what's he doing now? Is he still around?
He returned to Greensboro and has been of counsel with a fairly large firm here. He's 82 now. Still quite active, involved with the law firm. I spoke to his wife Shirley the other day, and she was just getting ready to go meet him on at some bit of firm business. He has a granddaughter who is a lawyer, and some very gratifying and rewarding family to surround him, and is still quite active in Greensboro.
How is it that you get appointed to the judgeship as an associate? And I guess he ran successfully several times
won three elections.
He won 3 elections, and then as soon as he gets to be Chief Justice, he loses.
Was defeated.
So,
and that was the election of 2000. North Carolina did elect a Democratic governor, but George Bush carried the state.
And Bush carried the state. He might have done a little different if it was 2008.
Possibly, yeah.
If he could have run with Obama. Mm-hmm.
It was a fairly close race, but it was not one that you would contest.
Well, so how much does race still affect politics? Tell us a little bit. We'll kind of get away from Henry Fry in the last few minutes of the show, just for in general. You've been covering this state for a long time. You've watched the state go from being all Democrat, right, to now a competitive state, Democrat and Republican. It's kind of a swing state. I think Obama won it in 2008 and also in last election too, I think.
Right.
But you've got a Republican-controlled legislature right now that's very conservative, doing all kinds of crazy stuff. Tell me what's going on in North Carolina politics right now with the Democrats, Republicans, and racial politics.
Well, I don't think I won't say that it's racial politics as much as it is just very conservative Republican politics. The legislature we have now is beyond anything I've ever seen before.
It's really amazing. It makes the news nationally, doesn't it?
Yeah. They basically are thumbing their nose. They got a governor elected who was a fairly moderate big city mayor from Charlotte, Pat McCrory. But they aren't paying any attention to him and have embarrassed him on a number of occasions, and basically have said, "Don't come to us. Don't call us. We'll call you." He's asked for some bonds to build roads and some other money for infrastructure, and they said, "Nah, we don't need bonds." The legislature is sort of its own. To my mind, they're sort of out of control, doing very. Expanding gun laws. You pick a topic, and they've touched on it.
Right, and they're passing some new voter laws trying to restrict the black vote.
Right. That was in 2011. They passed the most restrictive voter election laws that were really a reaction to I think the Obama victory in 2008.
Well, and then there was that Supreme Court decision that removed the federal oversight, right, which allowed them just to go do things that they wouldn't ordinarily have been able to do had it not been for that federal that U.S. Supreme Court decision.
So they passed a voter ID law. They rolled back the number of days available for early voting, out of precinct voting, with a provisional ballot was restricted, and that's in federal court right now. It's a crowd that says don't tread on me, but I live in Greensboro, and they just passed a law that affects only Greensboro and how we elect our city council. And the city council can't change the way it organizes itself unless it goes to the legislature.
How in the world did this happen? I mean, North Carolina is such an enlightened, you would think, an enlightened state. You've got UNC Chapel Hill, you've got Duke, you've got all the great universities there, the Research Triangle. It's
right.
The whole state is so diverse, and how in the world could you end up with a legislature that's this reactionary and conservative? How did that happen?
I think it's the fault of the Democratic Party that it basically fell apart in the last 4 to 5 years. It had no leadership to speak of. The governor before McCrory was Beverly Perdue, who didn't run again. She didn't run for a second term. She was not. She didn't. She wasn't able to get the party organized in such a way to defend itself. It held off the changes that were taking place in other states like Georgia and South Carolina and even Virginia for a while, but eventually the Republicans just found themselves in a very dominant position, except in the presidential race. We've lost. Let's see. We have 2, maybe 3 remaining Democratic congressmen who are Democrats. The rest are Republicans. They, of course, the governor. They now have a majority on the Supreme Court, and super majorities in both houses of the legislature. The Democratic Party is I won't say leaderless, but virtually leaderless. It doesn't have any. There's no one figure who, in office or even out of office, who can seems to be able to mount any kind of organized opposition to the Republicans.
Well, that's. Is there and nothing on the horizon really to indicate that there's a leader rising from the ashes, huh?
Not right now. My best hope for some move back the other way is that the moderate Republicans in the state, I think, are really getting fed up with the crowd that's running the legislature.
Right.
They've turned it into a rural versus urban fight on many issues. Generally speaking, I grew up in Florida, and down there used to be there was a crowd called the pork chop crowd, and they were the rural interest in the panhandle of Florida who were always fighting with Miami. Well, I think we got the same thing here. We've got the rural interests are dominant in the legislature, and the cities are getting beat up on and pretty regularly. The tax system is being overhauled in crazy ways that supposedly are going to make us all richer and wealthier and more prosperous, but it's creating a great deal of instability, I think, within the business community. They don't know what's going on. The governor says he needs money to go out and recruit business, and the legislature says, no, you don't, well, they'll just come here because people love North Carolina.
Well, I do love North Carolina, too. And listen, I'm going to have to end it right there. Howard Covington, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you. I appreciate your interest.
Okay, and if you've just joined us, this is George Yates, and I'm Justice for All. The last hour I've been with Howard Covington Jr. He's a pretty interesting, smart guy out of Greensboro. He wrote this book about Henry Fry, and we've been talking about the North Carolina first African-American Chief Justice and some other great topics regarding North Carolina and the modern South. So join us again next Saturday. I'm George Yates. This is Justice for All. Join me at 2 o'clock next week. Have a great day. Thank you.
The idea that they are going to be treated differently or abused because of who they love.